Snow drifted across the wire fences of the American POW camp, coating everything in a silence that felt almost holy. Inside the barracks, German prisoners huddled close, their breath forming clouds in the cold night air. They expected nothing tonight, no warmth, no joy, just another reminder that Christmas had become a ghost of the past. But then, the gates opened. U.S. guards, men who had fought these same Germans months earlier, began walking in, carrying boxes, food, and something even rarer than supplies, smiles. A phonograph crackled to life, playing a familiar hymn, and for the first time, the prisoners didn't feel like captives, they felt like men again. That night, under a sky still scarred by war, enemies shared laughter, bread, and tears. It wasn't written in any history book, but for those who lived it, it was a Christmas they never forgot. It was December 1944, a winter colder than any before. Across Europe, war had stripped the land of color, leaving only white snow and gray despair. Deep in the heart of America, far from the front lines, stood a quiet prisoner-of-war camp filled with captured German soldiers. For them, the war was over, but the punishment of memory continued. Behind the barbed wire, they carried the weight of defeat, guilt, and longing for homes that might no longer exist. Their guards, young Americans barely older than the prisoners, carried their own scars. Some had seen combat. Others had lost friends to the very men they now watched over. Yet, as Christmas approached, something in the air began to shift. The holiday that once divided faiths and nations started to whisper again, not of victory or vengeance, but of forgiveness. What happened next wasn't ordered by any general or written in any report. It was born from the simplest human truth: even in war, the heart remembers kindness. This is the story of one Christmas night, when enemies laid down hatred, if only for a few hours, and rediscovered what it meant to be human. The days leading up to Christmas were slow and bitter. The war had entered its final and most brutal phase in Europe, but in the small American POW camp tucked among pine trees and frozen fields, time moved differently. Snow buried the fences, muffled the guard towers, and covered footprints as soon as they were made. For the German prisoners, it was a world reduced to routine, roll call, meals, silence, and sleep. They rose before dawn each morning, the sound of a distant bugle echoing through the camp. Breakfast was thin oatmeal served in dented tin bowls, eaten under the watchful eyes of guards who had once faced them across battlefields. Most of the prisoners were young, boys who had believed in Hitler's promises, now stripped of uniforms and purpose. Some still clung to pride, others simply to survival. They spoke quietly, often of home, of mothers, sisters, wives. But as December deepened, those conversations grew fewer, replaced by an unspoken ache that hung in the cold air. The guards weren't much older. They too were far from home, missing the smell of pine trees, the laughter of family dinners, the warmth of Christmas lights. Many had joined the army not out of hate, but duty. And though they wore different flags, they understood the same loneliness. One guard in particular, Private William Hart, noticed it more than others. He had been stationed at the camp for 4 months, assigned to Watch Tower 3, the one overlooking the prisoner barracks. From up there, he could see everything: the shuffling of boots, the plumes of breath, the quiet attempts at conversation between men divided by language but united by fatigue. One afternoon, as he stood on duty, Hart saw something that stuck with him. A German prisoner, thin, with a torn jacket patched at the elbows, was carving something into a small piece of wood with a dull knife. Hours passed, and when Hart made his rounds again, he realized what it was: a tiny wooden cross. The man wasn't carving out of defiance or faith, it was desperation, a fragile attempt to remember that somewhere beyond these fences, it was still Christmas. That night, Hart couldn't sleep. He sat in the guardroom, staring at the frost building on the window. A sergeant passed by, joking that the Germans were lucky, at least they were warm. But Hart didn't laugh. "They're still human," he said quietly. The room went silent. Over the next few days, whispers began among the guards. No one said it outright, but each man felt the same tug. They didn't want a celebration, not really. They wanted to remember that beneath the uniforms, they were all sons, brothers, fathers. They wanted to do something that reminded them of home. By December 24th, the mood had changed. Snow had fallen thick across the camp, turning the barbed wire into shimmering silver threads. The prisoners were quieter than usual, perhaps sensing something they didn't yet understand. In the mess hall, the guards spoke in low voices. One of them, a corporal from Kansas, suggested bringing the prisoners some of the food that had been saved for the guardhouse dinner. Another offered to lend his phonograph, the only one in camp. No one had orders. There was no permission. Just a silent agreement among men who, for one night, wanted to stop being soldiers. As the sun disappeared and the sky turned violet, a strange anticipation filled the air. The Germans sat by their bunks, their breath fogging in the cold, the wooden cross still drying on a window ledge. Beyond the fence, a faint sound began to echo, soft at first, then clearer. It was music. Silent night. And for the first time in months, both sides looked toward the same song. The melody drifted across the frozen camp like a ghost from another world. Silent night, holy night, the old phonograph crackled with each note, but somehow, the imperfections made it more haunting, more real. The German prisoners froze where they sat, unsure if it was a trick of the wind. But then, one by one, faces lifted from the shadows. Through the fog of breath and snow, they could see movement by the main gate. The American guards, the same men who'd watched them with rifles all winter, were carrying boxes, lanterns, and something that looked like a Christmas tree, cut hastily from the woods nearby. No one had told them what was happening. No one dared to speak. The camp, which for months had lived on fear and orders, was now filled with a kind of fragile silence, the silence of disbelief. Private Hart led the group of guards. In his hands was a sack of canned fruit, bread, and a few chocolate bars. Behind him, Corporal Jenkins lugged a heavy pot of coffee, its steam curling into the frigid air. "Merry Christmas," Hart said quietly as they reached the fence. The German prisoners didn't move. For a moment, it seemed the two worlds, captor and captive, would remain forever divided by that barbed wire. Then, from the German side, one man stepped forward. He was the same prisoner Hart had seen carving the wooden cross. His name was Karl Weiss, a former schoolteacher from Cologne. He hesitated, eyes darting to the guards in the towers, expecting a shout or a warning. But none came. Hart reached through the wire and handed him a loaf of bread. Something broke inside the silence. Soon, more prisoners gathered, their breath visible in the moonlight. The guards passed what they had, coffee, bread, apples, even a few cigarettes. The Germans offered back what little they owned, a tin harmonica, a handful of handmade ornaments crafted from scraps, and the shy, trembling sound of voices joining the song. Still nacht heilig nacht. The mix of German and English words blended into something beyond language. It was the sound of humanity resurfacing, the fragile proof that even after years of killing, the heart could still remember peace. A guard produced candles, sticking them into the snow to form a makeshift altar. The light flickered on the wire fence, turning it from a symbol of division into a crown of glowing silver. Hart and Weiss stood across from each other, neither speaking. They didn't need to. In that moment, they were not enemies, just two men far from home, clinging to the memory of better days. Inside the barracks, the atmosphere transformed. Guards and prisoners sat together near the entrance, careful not to cross boundaries that could draw punishment if discovered. Some talked softly about their families. Others just listened to the music and stared at the sky, lost in their thoughts. The Germans were surprised when one American brought out an old harmonica and began to play a tune they recognized, O Tannenbaum. The prisoners laughed softly, and a few even clapped. Someone produced a small deck of cards, and soon, laughter began to replace the awkward silence. For the first time in months, the camp sounded like life again. Private Hart took a sip of cold coffee, watching the flickering candles dance on the snow. He wondered what his mother was doing that night back in Ohio, whether she was lighting the same candles, praying for him, just as these men probably prayed for their sons. The realization struck him hard: war had made them strangers, but it couldn't make them different. Later, as midnight neared, Carl Weiss stood and held up the small wooden cross he had carved. He spoke in broken English, his voice unsteady. "For you," he said, offering it through the fence. Hart hesitated, then reached out and took it. The wood was rough, but warm from Weiss's hand. "Danke," Hart whispered. A faint wind stirred the snow, carrying the last verses of Silent Night into the distance. For a few seconds, the camp glowed, not from light, but from something deeper. The kind of warmth that no fire could create and no general could command. When the final note faded, there was no applause. Only quiet, the sacred kind that follows truth. Men wiped their eyes quickly, embarrassed by their own humanity. The guards helped the prisoners back to their barracks, careful not to let the magic break too soon. Before dawn, the tree was gone, the candles melted, and the phonograph silent once more. To anyone visiting the next morning, it looked like nothing had happened. The fences stood the same, the snow still fell, the guards resumed their watch. But those who were there, both the Americans and the Germans, knew that something had changed forever. They had fought each other as soldiers. They had faced each other as enemies. But that night, under a sky heavy with snow and silence, they had shared something sacred. Not a truce ordered by nations, but a peace born in the hearts of men. When the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, it painted the camp in shades of pale gold and silver. The snow glistened like shards of glass, and for a brief moment, the barbed wire looked less like a prison wall and more like frost-covered lace. The night of warmth had ended, but the feeling it left behind lingered, quiet, unspoken, but powerful. The guards resumed their posts, rifles slung over shoulders, faces unreadable. The prisoners lined up for roll call, boots crunching against the snow. To an outsider, it looked like any other morning in a POW camp. But those who had been awake through the night knew better. Something invisible had shifted. The usual tension, that thin, electric line of fear between captor and captive, was gone. In its place was a fragile understanding, like the first thaw after a long winter. Private William Hart felt it most. As he stood by Tower 3, his hands numb from the cold, he reached into his coat pocket and touched the small wooden cross Carl Weiss had given him. The rough edges pressed against his palm, grounding him. He didn't know what compelled him, but he found himself whispering a prayer, not for victory, but for peace. He had never done that before. Down below, the German prisoners began their daily chores, clearing snow, repairing fences, hauling supplies. But even their movements seemed different. They spoke softly to one another, not in despair, but in reflection. A few even nodded politely at the guards, small gestures that would have been unthinkable a week earlier. That night, Hart couldn't stop thinking about Weiss. He wondered what his life had been before the war, if he had children, if he'd once stood in a classroom teaching them about the world that now lay shattered. War had turned teachers into prisoners, farmers into soldiers, and boys into killers. But for one night, it had turned them back into men. As weeks passed, life in the camp returned to its rhythm. Orders were followed, fences repaired, and discipline restored. But the story of that Christmas spread quietly, from guard to guard, from barrack to barrack. It became a whisper of hope in a world gone mad. By the spring of 1945, the war was nearing its end. Rumors of Germany's collapse drifted through the camp. Some prisoners feared returning home to ruins, others longed for it desperately. When the surrender finally came, the prisoners were informed they would soon be released. Many stood silently, unsure of what freedom even meant anymore. On the day the first group departed, the guards lined up by the gate. It was an odd farewell, neither celebration nor sorrow, just mutual respect. When Carl Weiss reached the front of the line, he stopped in front of Private Hart. The two men locked eyes for a long moment. Weiss smiled faintly, then extended his hand. Hart shook it firmly, the wooden cross still resting in his pocket. Weiss spoke softly, his accent thick but words clear. "Thank you, for remembering we were men." Hart wanted to reply, but no words came. He simply nodded. Sometimes, silence said more than language ever could. Years later, when the war was nothing more than a distant scar in history books, Hart kept that wooden cross on his mantle. His children would sometimes ask about it, and he would tell them the story, not of battles or bombs, but of the night when enemies shared Christmas. He would say, "That's when I learned that peace isn't signed on paper. It's found in moments like that." Across the ocean, in a small town near Cologne, Carl Weiss told his grandchildren the same story. He never forgot the kindness of the American guards, how they treated him not as a prisoner, but as a person. Each Christmas, he placed a candle by his window, the flame flickering against the cold glass, a silent tribute to a night that had restored his faith in humanity. Both men lived full lives, but neither forgot that winter. Decades later, when historians spoke of treaties and generals, their story was rarely mentioned. Yet, in that small camp, far from the glory and horror of battle, something extraordinary had happened, proof that even in war's darkest winter, the warmth of compassion could still survive. The war had ended long ago. But on that one night, Christmas of 1944, the light of peace had already begun to return. History rarely remembers the quiet nights. It records the battles, the victories, the treaties, but not the moments when men rediscovered their humanity. Yet, sometimes, it's those forgotten nights that tell us more about who we truly are than any war ever could. That Christmas of 1944 wasn't about nations or uniforms. It wasn't about politics, revenge, or glory. It was about men, cold, exhausted, and far from home, choosing to see each other not as enemies, but as reflections of themselves. In a frozen corner of America, surrounded by fences meant to divide, the spirit of Christmas broke through. It slipped past rifles and ranks, melting the ice between hearts that had been hardened by war. And though the snow soon covered the footprints of that night, its memory remained, carried quietly in the souls of those who lived it. For Private William Hart and Carl Weiss, that single evening became a compass for the rest of their lives, a reminder that kindness, once shared, never truly dies. Because even in humanity's darkest hours, there are sparks of light. And sometimes, those sparks don't come from victory, but from a cup of coffee shared through barbed wire. On a silent, holy night that no one ever forgot.